Welcome to PR. You're listening to the Powell Movement.
Welcome to the Powell Movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and in my world, we just passed episode 200, which is a milestone. And I have another milestone right around the corner, 1 million downloads. Currently, we're at about 950,000 downloads, and I anticipate we will hit the million download number in about a month. I was gonna have a contest around when we would hit the number, but to tell you the truth, it's too much work. So I'm just gonna update you in the intros, and I'll post an Instagram screenshot when this happens. Oh, it's so exciting. Not really, but it is something to check off the list. One thing I haven't touched on is the election. The results are in, and it has gone exactly how I thought it would. And I'm sure a lot of other people felt the same way, other than my dad. He was sure it was going to be a landslide for Trump. I thought it was going to be close, but that Biden would take it. So we have a president-elect who has not been recognized by our sitting president, and well, while I think we will see Biden in office, I do think things are going to get really interesting over the next couple of months. I'd say they're going to sell a lot of newspapers off of this, but no one reads the paper these days. And now, no one is going to read Powder, as I have received my last ever Powder magazine, and that is a sad thing. A sad day for ski media, a sad day for print, but everybody should know that print is not dead, and between the Ski Journal, the Snowboard Journal, Free Skier, the Mountain Gazette, Forecast Magazine, SBC Skier, there are plenty of great magazines to support with a subscription. Right now, Powder, Transworld, Snowboarder are currently dead for the time being, and our democracy is being questioned, and we have a whole nother set of problems on our hands. That coronavirus, that thing that some said would be gone after the election, well, it didn't go away, and it's worse than ever. Like, we are seeing record numbers. My state is back on lockdown. We'll be this way for the next month, and it sucks, but it is what it is. And my family, we're in a good situation. And I'm sure there's others that are not. And these are the times that we need to check in on our friends and make sure they're good. But don't be fucking idiots out there. Wear a mask and be smart for the greater good of everyone. I know everyone has an opinion on whether they should wear a mask or they shouldn't, or it might not be good for you. Who cares what your opinion is? Just do it for the greater good of people. And hopefully we can get these numbers back down so when this vaccine is ready, we can all take it and go back to living our life like we used to. Which is crazy that it's almost been a year of living in fear of this virus. For me personally, while I am in lockdown, I do have some good news and some bad news, I guess, leading up to this time stuck inside. The good news is that Traeger called and was like, hey, do you want to upgrade your grill to the Ironwood 885? And without thinking, I was like, of course I do. And now, in the next month or so, I have a new grill coming that can cook like 10 whole chickens. I have 3 people that live at my house, so that's kind of funny because we are never going to fill this grill. But the grill itself is insane. It's got the super smoke feature that I've always wanted. It works with Alexa. There's so many bells and whistles to this thing. I am so stoked about it. And with everything Traeger, when you get on the list with them, packages just start arriving. I've received about 10 boxes already, and this company really knows what they are doing marketing-wise. I'm so stoked on their product, and every day something else arrives, and it makes me want to talk about it. So Traeger knows what they're doing, and the food that you can cook on your Traeger grill is unbelievable. So highly recommend everyone get a Traeger, especially if you're going into lockdown again, because that will make your life a lot better, because good food goes a long way in these times. So that's the good news. The bad news is that I missed the memo on pre-ordering the new Xbox, and now I won't be able to get my kid what he wants for Christmas. I'm going to try to do the Black Friday thing. I'll get up super early and I will wait at GameStop, and most likely I will still fail. I will not get this new Xbox. But whatever, you can't always be an awesome dad. And I guess there is some more good news that I forgot to mention. I got a brand new pair of skis, some ripsticks from Elan, and I got my season pass from the summit at Snoqualmie. So while my kid won't be able to game on a brand new console for a while, he will be able to shred 45 minutes from Seattle at the summit at Snoqualmie, and if you haven't been there, I highly recommend checking it out. It's the convenient way to go ski when you live in Seattle, and the terrain is awesome. But what the hell am I even talking about? I have a podcast to get to, and my guest this week is a legendary dude that old guys know all about, and the young guys, they might not even know he existed. I'm talking about OG Burton rider Bob Klein. And before we get into the podcast and hear a history lesson from Bob, I need to ask you to do a few things for me. First, I want you to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to me. Second, please tell a friend about the show. And third, please support my amazing sponsors who make this thing happen. They're Stanley, the 10 Barrel Brewery, Cole Headwear, and Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. Now, let's talk to Bob Klein. So when I think of athletes that you've worked with over time, Sean Palmer, Brad Holmes, Danny Cass, all huge names and dudes that just exude confidence. And when you think about the big names you've been associated with, are there a few characteristics that all these guys have in common, like the common denominator that makes that super athlete in these sports?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the common denominator with at least those three guys, Danny Cass, Sean Palmer, and Brad, are a sense of individuality that a lot of other people don't have. So in other words, when confronted with choices to make and being pushed in one direction or another by a sponsor or organization, all these guys have pretty much made their own decisions and were willing to stick to those decisions and suffer consequences if there were any.
And have you worked with those guys that where if these guys are out of the box and they kind of do whatever they want, you have to clean up the mess? But did you work with guys as well that were fully in the box and that were super easy to work with but might not have been your favorite people?
Yeah, definitely. I would say the majority of my clients, which over the years is probably 50 people at least, most of them, I would say, no slight on any one individual or any of them, but I think that a lot of them are young and a little bit potentially naive to the industry and how it works and the influence in the industry. So it wasn't very difficult for a lot of these people to have a bug put in their ear of which way they should go, whether it was a parent or a company telling them, and they became frightened to actually think outside of that and to make their own decisions. So I would say those were actually more difficult challenges for me because I prefer the individual mentality, even if I didn't agree with those decisions that some of my clients made, like Sean or Danny in particular. I felt like at least they took a stand. They knew exactly what direction they wanted to go in, and I either had to make it work or try to explain to them why it didn't work.
Were there also the times where they took a stand and they did what they wanted and that pissed off someone else who had something going on and you had to explain to that person why you weren't going to have Sean or Danny at some event or at part of something that you had promised them to? Did you have to deal with a lot of that shit as well?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, I would say particularly events, mainly the X Games. I mean, the Olympics are a little bit different because there's so much other control involved, but the X Games were always a challenge with both Sean and Danny in the sense that PR people would become my best buddies because they wanted all this activity from my clients. And if my clients didn't want to participate, I would be told directly by those PR people that I needed to get control of my athlete, which always kind of cracked me up because, that wasn't the way I saw things at all.
They need to make time for your athlete if they want them.
Well, I mean, there's a balance for sure. I mean, I learned over the years too that if you cooperate, you're going to probably get a little bit more publicity out of it and a little bit more favoritism from the media as opposed to just shunning them. Palmer was a character who pretty much hated dealing with the media. He thought the X Games was a big circus. And when he was the star of their show, he didn't seem to really enjoy it. I mean, for him, it seemed to be much more about proving to himself that he could win at all these different sports. And he just didn't feel that he needed to participate in the media. And that was quite a challenge for me because I tried to explain to him that it's a big system. And if you participate in the media, that makes you more valuable to your sponsors. And then we can ask for more money. And he just cut through all that bullshit and said, fuck that. I'm Sean Palmer and look what I'm doing. And they ought to fucking pay me.
And while these guys have those kind of characteristics, they have that supreme confidence, I'm guessing that you have to have some of that too, and that individuality. Because when I look at your LinkedIn, your intro paragraph about yourself, and I'm going to read it, it says, my global experience in action sports predates the term action sports or even extreme sports. My personality makes me a connector by nature. I was an influencer years before influencers had a name. Travel is second nature, and my connections span all corners of the earth. I work with young people particularly well, and I refuse to grow up. I personally read this, and I think this dude has to be one of the most old school, cool guys out there if he's going to write that about himself, or it's total bullshit. And in your case, it's all real, which means that you must have some kind of trait that has allowed you to manage the times and careers of the most important and most difficult athletes probably to work with. What do you think you have inside you that makes it that you can work with a Palmer or work with a cookie cutter guy as well?
Well, that's a nice compliment. What I wrote about myself for LinkedIn was really at the urging of Marty Kerrigan when he was helping me a little over a year ago to redo my LinkedIn profile because I had just lost a job and was looking for work. And he really convinced me, hey, you're a global connector. You have all this experience that nobody else has. So make sure that people know that. And I think to answer your question more directly, I was raised by two parents who really wanted their kids to experience life on their own and make their own decisions about what they wanted to do and who they wanted to be. And so that was the foundation that gave me the confidence, or at least the ability to, I don't know, I guess in my youth, I was a lot more confrontational. So when I got into snowboarding and became a pro and got really involved in the industry, I pretty much had a fuck you attitude because I saw how skateboarding developed. I was a skateboarder from California, and as a skateboarder from California in the 70s and the early 80s in particular, and seeing all those pros and going to a lot of contests, it really gave me the feeling that this is how snowboarding needed to be. It had to be based on this kind of fuck you attitude, anarchy rules, and break the rules. At the same time, it was tempered with, I guess, growing up in a ski town and being a ski racer as a kid too. I also respected mountain etiquette and the rules of the mountains. So there's a balance in between. But I think, again, to kind of answer your question about my LinkedIn profile, I feel like I just developed all those feelings from the backbone and the foundation that my parents gave me. And I think that it's very important in action sports in particular to maintain that. And I think that's one of the challenges that action sports went through. And not to get too long-winded, but I think that's one of the problems that action sports has faced and why it's a non-factor in the bigger picture of sports today.
Well, I feel like the reason it's a non-factor in the bigger picture of sports today is that there's so many choices. When you were a kid in the 70s and you grew up in, I think, the LA area, you had like a doctor father, there's like 5 kids in your house. You didn't have many choices. Was it like a privileged life? Was there country clubs? And I hear doctor, I think big money. I don't know.
Well, privileged, but not country clubs. So my dad, he started a medical practice east of LA in 1960 and pretty much retired when he was young in 1969.
Whoa.
And he was the equivalent of a millionaire at that time, which in those days there were only about 300 millionaires in the whole country. So he was in really good position. And he grew up poor. My mom grew up poor. And they had read a book called Summer Hill, which is a school in England that gave the students equal say. And my parents were just so inspired by that book that they felt like their kids should have the Summer Hill experience too. And we moved to West LA and lived in one of J. Paul Getty's old mansions.
Whoa.
And my parents bought us all kinds of stuff. And it was a little bit crazy. They bought us go-karts and motorcycles and everything that we wanted. So, yeah, it was a totally privileged lifestyle. But at the same time, they met some hippies and got totally into the hippie lifestyle too. So they realized that their kids should have freedom and they could finance all the freedom. And I'm just always blown away by the patience that they showed us, because 4 kids that got virtually everything they wanted can be a challenge for sure.
Yeah, no, I was part of the exact same kind of growing up. Maybe not the exact same. I didn't live in J. Paul Getty's house or anything like that. But is it skiing the big family hobby? Do you guys go ski every weekend, Big Bear and stuff like that?
We actually went to Mammoth a lot when I was young. My parents would make the drive, and they really enjoyed the time on the chairlift with the kids. Confined quarters for the most part, and then no escape for the kids. So they would take each one of us for like a birthday trip. They would just take one kid. Like I remember a couple of times going to Mammoth, just me and my parents, and having a nice weekend with them. And my dad wanted to get out of LA. He felt like there was crime and smog and traffic and everything else. So he thought, hey, we should just move to a ski town. And my brothers and I played hockey. So the ski town had to have an ice rink. And the only place that was a ski town that had an ice rink in the early 70s was actually Squaw Valley. They looked at Aspen, they looked in Vail, and Aspen was overpriced because the homes were over $100,000 back then, and that was too expensive for them. So they felt like staying in California and moving to Tahoe was a good idea. And there was the old Olympic ice rink, Blythe Arena in Squaw Valley, and that was pretty much the deciding factor for us.
And were you a serious hockey player? I mean, if the family moves to a place with a rink, I'm sure hockey's a big deal. But were team sports like a driving factor in your life growing up too?
A little bit, not really mine so much. My oldest brother, Dave, he's totally into sports, totally into stats. He's an accountant now. He's always been into numbers and counting and stuff. So he was way into all the different team sports, and he's 4 years older than me. So I always wanted to keep up with my older brothers. So I just kind of emulated them. And hockey was the one sport that we all really loved. Like we played Little League, and I played Pop Warner when we moved to Tahoe, and freshman football in high school. But I didn't like the jock factor at all. I thought that the attitudes of the coaches and the other players was pretty shitty for the most part. But hockey was totally different. It was so obscure in those days, especially in California, that it was just more of a fun thing for us to do. And me and my 2 brothers were into it. So that seemed to be an important factor for my parents when they decided they wanted to move to a ski town.
And when you get to Squaw or wherever your house is, it seems like you have whatever you want, like mini ramps, bike tracks, skate ramps, arcade games, all different shit. Was your house the place where people came to hang out?
It totally was. We moved on Valentine's Day in 1974. So I was 9, and my brothers and I immediately made friends with other kids. It was funny because my dad said he would buy us a season's pass. We lived on the West Shore, and so we had passes at Homewood and Tahoe Ski Bowl. And he said he would buy us a pass if we took one run with him. So every year, the first day of the year, we would take one run with Dad, and then we would just go, run away with our friends, which wasn't my parents' idea at all of moving to a ski town. They loved that time on the chairlift, but as soon as we made friends, we pretty much abandoned our parents. But yeah, we made so many friends immediately. And my parents were so open, and we had pinball machines and ping pong table, and we had motorcycles, and we immediately made a BMX track in the backyard, and Tahoe Ski Bowl was right up the street, so we could get onto those trails in the summertime on our motorcycles and just go for as long as we wanted to. And all the neighborhood kids were totally into it. Plus, my parents were super permissive with partying. They didn't want to see it necessarily, and they didn't participate in it at all. And my dad being a physician and my mom being a nurse, they discouraged smoking in particular and drug use. They weren't really into, but they tolerated it. They were like, if you're going to do it, just do it in your room, and would rather you do it here. So pretty much every day from, I would say, 1974 until we moved to Tahoe City, and even after that, there were 10 kids in the house all the time. And my mom would make these huge meals for everybody, and all the neighborhood kids thought my parents were the coolest. Their parents were freaked out, though. Their parents thought my parents were giving their kids drugs or doing really weird things. And my parents were never that way. They didn't even do drugs themselves. They just let their kids do them.
And I don't want to date you by any means, but I will a little bit. In the 70s, I feel like skateboarding really started to gain traction with the invention of the urethane wheel. And do you remember when that happened?
I'm probably a little bit young for that transition. I mean, I do remember a couple of my very first skateboards had clay wheels. But when I was about 7 or 8, I had a really good friend. His name's Tony Fitzpatrick, and his brother pushed us into all these different sports. And we just thought that skateboarding was super cool. And I remember taking the bus down to Westwood. My dad would give me like $20, which at the time was like 100.
Yeah.
And we would go down to Westwood, and there were skateboard shops, and we'd go in there and just look at the glass cases full of urethane wheels. So it was definitely a new thing. And I guess it was really that same realization that all the other way better skateboarders than me had, that, hey, these things work, and now you can do a lot more than what you could do with the clay wheels.
And another thing that came out in the late 70s, I think, and it was like a skateboard accessory to make your skateboard work on snow. I think it was called a skeeter. And what the fuck was a skeeter?
Yeah, I saw ads for the Skeeter in Skateboarder magazine, maybe even in Powder. And I wanted the Skeeter. It was just like little mini skis that looked like they strapped to the wheels of your skate deck. But I think I even knew before, just thinking it through, like, that's never going to work here because the snow's too deep. And, not even thinking about hard pack, because there was no concept of taking a snowboard onto a chairlift. It was really like, oh, wow, that would be so cool to be able to surf in the snow. And there were a few different options at the time as far as just like looking in magazines. And the Skeeter looked kind of cool in concept, but it really looked stupid in reality.
Now it's time for me to take a sponsor break, and my first sponsor is the 10 Barrel Brewery out of Bend, Oregon. They have been brewing the Northwest's best beer and supporting all things ski, snowboard, and bike since 2006. When I say their beer is the best, I really mean that. Recently, I've been drinking Nature Calls Mountain IPA, and not only does it have the best name in beer, a portion of the proceeds benefits the Conservation Alliance, so it does make a difference. And as far as supporting action sports, no other beer comes close to what 10 Barrel does for ski, snowboard, and bike. Next time you're at the store, pick up a 6-pack of 10 Barrel and support the beer that supports the sports we love, the 10 Barrel Brewery. My next sponsor is Stanley. You know, the brand that has been around for over 100 years, the ones that invented that keep things hot and keep things cold category. Back in the day, you could count on your grandpa's green Stanley to keep the hot chocolate, soups, and so much more hot. Well, these days, Stanley still makes that same green bottle, and they also make so many more products that will keep your liquids hotter and colder for a couple hours longer than any other product on the market. You know I think you deserve the best for less, and I'm going to make that happen again at Stanley. To save 30% on all Stanley products, head on over to stanley-pmi.com, Go shopping, head to checkout, enter the code drinkfast, that's all one word, all lowercase, and you're good to go. You'll save 30%. Those are my sponsors. Now let's get back into the podcast. It's around this time that you see the first ads for snowboards. You see like a Winterstick ad and you want to get one once you see it.
Yeah. Powder Magazine did a profile on Dmitry Milovich and his crew in Utah, and it was pretty much pictures that I think they had pulled from a movie that he had made, a 16 millimeter movie, and it just looked so amazing. And I remember reading the article that they would hike up what's called Cardiac Ridge or Cardiac Peak or something like that, which I guess is across the valley from Snowbird and Alta. It just looked amazing because they were actually surfing in the snow. And when I saw that, I said, Dad, I want one of those. That's for sure what I need to get. And we had no way of getting them. I mean, there was no mail order back in those days. There was definitely no internet. So he picked up the phone and called Dmitry Milovich. My dad is a pretty sharp negotiator, and somehow he got Dmitry to send out 2 roundtail winter sticks and that 16 millimeter movie. So I was pretty much the first one in the area to get those boards. There might have been another kid in school that had it, but Tahoe's so spread out that kids from as far southwest as Tahoma and as far as the Nevada state line all went to the same schools, but we didn't always know each other. But as far as I knew, I was pretty much the first one to get these winter sticks and started to try to get them to work. But for me, the first year just was a joke. Like, I took it up to Tahoe Ski Bowl and hiked up in waist deep powder and couldn't get it to work. And I realized a couple years later that it was because I was on too flat of a hill. But my friend Alan Arnbrister was like, hey, if you're not going to use those things, let me borrow one of them. And he took one and started to get it dialed. And that's kind of how the progression of our riding went. But the movie was kind of funny too, because I had this 16 millimeter movie that I may have gotten in, February of 1978. And by September, Dmitry said, hey, if you can get a ski area let you up on the chairlift, you can keep the boards, but I'm going to need the movie back. So by September of 78, he still hadn't gotten the movie back, and I still hadn't seen it yet. And he called us up and said, I need that movie back. And I definitely didn't want to send it to him without seeing it. So I took it to school, and we had this great teacher, Mr. Dagling, who was instrumental in creating the Tahoe Rim Trail. That was way later, but he was an outdoor kind of guy, and he was a really nice guy. And I took it to his class, and he said, well, absolutely, I'll show it to the class. And if you let me keep this movie for a week, I'll show it to every class that comes through here.
No way.
So pretty much all these kids at North Tahoe High School got to see it. And when I go back for any reunions, there's always somebody who brings it up. Like, who would have ever thought snowboarding would have grown? I remember when you brought that movie to class. And some of the other people in my class were Tom Burt and Terry Kidwell and some other people who got into it.
So like the legends of the sport happen to be at your high school at that point, or the first wave of legends that come through the sport, and they see your movie and that helps influence them. Like, they probably had seen snowboarding in Thrasher and seen it in Powder, but when they see that video with you, they're like, holy shit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was definitely helpful. Terry was into skateboarding. Tom Burt was into skateboarding. Tom and I were pretty good friends. And I remember in 7th grade, Tom had a ramp in his yard, and it was gnarly. And I remember slamming on it a whole bunch of times. So, the foundation was there. And I'm not so sure that the catalyst for Tom, especially, because he had another friend, Bob Porter, who had a winter stick, and he says he went once or twice with him prior to that movie being shown. But I think things really started to take off about 1979, 1980 in our area.
The cool thing about that whole story about you getting the winter sticks is that's kind of where you learn who you're going to be. Like, you see your dad call Dimitri and be like, hey, I want to do this, and make a deal, and he makes shit happen. And I would think that like a lesson like that, where you see that happen and he makes it work, comes with you your whole career. Like, you're going to make shit happen for yourself regardless of what people tell you the outcome can be.
Yeah, I mean, back to what I said before, I think I had the foundation that gave me, I guess, the security or the backbone to just be who I was. And just like anybody, I mean, everybody's insecure. I have my insecurities for sure. But I think I decided early on that I was just going to make decisions how I wanted to make them. And I didn't care what the consequences were. And I was the class clown a lot. And I got really good grades if I wanted to, but a lot of times I didn't really care about it. And I had more fun giving teachers a hard time. And I just made those decisions early on. And I think that it was a natural transition once snowboarding became an important factor in my life, that I felt it was really important for snowboarders to make individual decisions. And that was one of the main reasons that I think I became an agent later on. Is I felt like these guys need a facilitator to kind of reflect what their individual decisions are.
But back then, before you're thinking about other people, you're just passionate about the sport and you guys are trying to ride as much as you possibly can. That's when the Tahoe City halfpipe would come together. That's something that you guys sessioned a lot. Can you describe what that place was?
Yeah, it was the old dump. And it's funny because I still tell the owner of the dump, it's the Akiro family, they had no idea what was going on. I think it was probably, we used to have what was called the senior party, which was always just a huge keg party in the forest. And they hosted it at that old dump. The dump was there, I don't know when they moved it to Truckee, but they had this big property, and I don't even know how or why, but Mark Anelick told me about it. And at the same time, Terry Kidwell and Alan Armbruster were four-wheeling around a lot. And so Terry says that they found it around the same time that Mark found it. So there's a little bit of a dispute in who found it first.
Like 8 people care about that.
Yeah, exactly. But I just remember Mark Anelick telling me, hey, there's this gully that we could make into a half pipe. And Alan Armbruster was really the catalyst for it. He had so much energy, and a lot of it was probably cocaine inspired, but he totally got into, hey, let's make this a half pipe. Let's go up there, bring shovels, and we would spend like 2 or 3 hours just packing out the in run, making a wall on the other side. And it was so funny because, you know, you'd spend all this time making a perfect in run, perfect flat bottom, perfect wall on the other side. And then some sketchy guy like me would drop in and slam on the flat bottom. And then you'd have to start digging all over again.
And that eventually became not your scene, where you ended up going hiking in the backcountry, just trying to figure out snowboarding. And what became the Sims team pretty much owned that spot. Is that kind of how it evolved?
Yeah, I mean, I got okay enough where I could go up the other wall and I could do a backside air or something, but I just was never that good of a skateboarder, and skate tricks for me were kind of hard to do. Snowboarding was great because the board's attached to your feet, so it was a lot easier. But when it came to that hard snow in run and the transition and then the other side with the wall, Terry and Alan and Keith Kimmel and a bunch of those guys who were better skateboarders than me, they seemed to adapt way better to it. And I liked it, but I also felt like at the same time, skiers like Scott Schmidt and my friend Kent Smith, who was also a really good skier, I mean, the whole Squaw Valley scene was starting to happen, and people were starting to see movies and photos of Scott Schmidt doing really crazy things down some really insane chutes and lines.
Yeah.
And I felt like that could be done on a Winterstick, or that could be done on a snowboard. And that was my goal at the time. And I became a little bit, I wouldn't say disillusioned, but I just wasn't really as into the scene of going up and digging the Tahoe City halfpipe just for one hit, I felt like powder turns were more rewarding for me, probably because I wasn't very good at the other thing. And powder was starting to become really fun for me. So in my junior and senior year in high school, I would just go up to Mount Rose alone and go hiking alone with no idea of avalanches and definitely had no safety precautions. But I would just go hike around all by myself. And that was a great time in my life for sure.
You're in the backcountry at this point. Those dudes are hitting this half pipe. And there's also a whole nother faction of race going on. On the East Coast, it's especially big, but that's going to hit all over the country. And I think the first contest you end up at is maybe in 1981. It's like the King of the Hill event. This is probably the first contest where all the heroes of snowboarding are at, even though no one's looked at as a hero yet because you're all dirtbag snowboarders. But what's the vibe like at that first contest where everybody is on the same wavelength of thought process of how amazing the sport is? And when you come together, is it just amazing?
Yeah, I mean, I had seen the first Burton catalog and became very familiar with the characters in that catalog. And I knew at that point, I knew Tom Sims loosely from the Tahoe City halfpipe. And I wasn't into the Sims scene at all because I felt like a guy from Southern California who had a skateboard company, and a big turnoff from the Tahoe City halfpipe was when Tom Sims showed up with a bunch of pro skaters and a photographer. And I felt like, these guys aren't even digging. They're just showing up and taking pictures and they're going to get all the glory. And I was kind of a negative attitude, an extension of that confidence or backbone to be able to be who I was also negativity. And I'm not super proud of the negative aspects of my life, but that's the truth. I was pretty cynical and negative about those guys showing up. So I gravitated towards Burton a little bit more, even though I was still riding a Winterstick in 1981. I had seen the Burton catalog. So showing up at that Ski Cooper event in 81 was really interesting. Me and Alan Armbruster flew out to Denver, and the Winterstick rep at the time in Reno was a guy named Chuck Amadon, and he picked me and Alan up at the airport, and we went up there and did the contest. And it was really interesting because we thought we were going to win it. We felt like nobody else was going to have the skills that we had, and we were just going to beat everybody. And we immediately were humbled because we were on these boards that had these terrible, not even bungee cords. They were the stretchy nylon straps those old Wintersticks had, and they froze up, and we had no control on those boards on anything but powder. And meanwhile, Doug Boughton was killing it on a Burton, and even the Winterstick guys, I can't remember their names, but they were the two guys that Dimitri brought out to that event. And just seeing them was just so humbling. And I was immediately in awe of Jake Burton and Andy Coughlin and Chris Carroll and Doug Boughton especially, because he was the ruler of that contest.
And is it from that contest there and maybe from the lessons learned from your dad that you start reaching out to Burton or to Jake and like sending him letters and just letting him know who you are and you're going to be hitting all the races and you should be on Burton and look at me, look at me? Is that when that starts for you?
I wasn't quite that process. It was more about just trying to get my hands on one of the boards. I would say that really started in 1983 at the first World Championships. And I just felt like, man, I need to have the same boards that those guys are on, because Chris Carroll won the downhill and they had these performers that Jake had glued P-Tex onto the bottom. And it just was amazing to me that they had so much control. They were so much faster. They were so much better than what I thought everybody else was doing, that I wanted to do that. And I wanted to ride those boards. So I started calling Burton every day, just finding some excuse to call up Burton to figure out if I could get a board. And I guess it was the spring of 83. I finally talked Jake into selling me one of those team boards. And I was so disappointed because it seemed like it took forever to show up, and it was late spring and there wasn't much snow left. And I kept on thinking, man, if that board doesn't show up, I'm not even going to get to ride it until next year. And it finally showed up, but it had all these air bubbles underneath it. So it was like P-Tex glued onto the bottom, but it had 100 air bubbles in it. And I was so bummed out, like, man, it's not even on there properly and it's going to come off. But I wish I had that board now. It's probably worth quite a bit of money.
So is that the first Burton board you got on? Because I know you eventually go to the World Championships in Vermont. I think that's the event that becomes the U.S. Open. And the story that I had heard is like Jake had some boards and you were like, I want one. And he's like, well, you can buy one for me. And you bought it. Is that a different story, or is that board you were talking about?
I bought that board after the World Championships in Soda Springs. Jake actually was really an interesting guy because he was very curious about what everybody else was doing, but he was really subtle about it. So I remember he came up to me at the Worlds because I had a homemade board, or a board that Winterstick rep had made for me. And Hexel had a ski factory in Reno. So this guy, Chuck, took some base material out of the garbage can at the Hexel factory, and he made boards that were pretty much the nose of a Winterstick, and then he would make different like surf-shaped tails, and he called them zip sticks. And he made this custom zip stick for me, and he put a base on it, but the base happened to be a cross-country ski base. So it had fish scales on the bottom of it. So every time I rode down a hill, you'd hear this whizzing sound because of the fish scales. And Jake came up to me at that first World Championships, and he looked at my board. He goes, hey, can I check out your board? And I was like, sure. And he looked at the bottom and he's like, don't you think it'd go faster without the fish scales? I felt kind of stupid, but I didn't know what else to say to him. So I was like, yeah, I'm sure it would. But fast forward, I thought, yeah, he's right. I got to get a real board with the real P-Tex on the bottom. So I bought one of his and rode that a few times, but it wasn't really, at the same time, he was selling performers. Like, they perfected gluing the P-Tex to the base. And I think they found a source of wider P-Tex, because back in those days it was narrower just for skis. So they had to glue two pieces on vertically.
Okay.
And I think that's where the air bubbles came from. But he must have found a better source, because I bought a performer that had P-Tex on it. And then I customized it. I made the fins shallower. I got some bindings from Chuck Barfoot, or maybe actually even Sims bindings, the plastic two-piece Sims bindings, and really made it work. And that board became a perfect tool for me. And I brought it out to the 1984 Nationals in Vermont. That was my first trip to Vermont. I went with a guy named Cadman Bear, and we ended up meeting Brad Stewart and a friend of his in the Albany bus station, and we all decided to stay in a motel room together to save cost. And when we got to Manchester, we went into the Burton showroom, or Burton workshop, whatever it was called, and we met Jake for the first time. And Jake handed Brad Stewart and Cadman Bear these team boards. And when I looked at the team boards, they were one step beyond what I had, which was the performer with P-Tex, but these had edges on them too. And I immediately blurted out, can I get one too? And Jake looked at me and he was just like, this kid that's been bugging me every day for a year. He just kind of shook his head and he was like, no, man, those are for team riders. And I was like, oh, okay. And, being the privileged kid that I was, I started thinking while we were in the workshop, and I was like, I bet my dad would let me use his credit card and I could just buy one. So I said, well, will you sell me one? And he's like, oh yeah, sure. $150 or whatever. So I bought the board, and I thought for sure I'm going to become the national champ because I'm better than all these guys and I'm going to kick some ass. And the next day we went up to practice, and it was like 20 below zero. You could see beer bottles through the ice. It was just super gnarly Vermont conditions. And Andy Coughlin and all the guys in the Burton catalog were there, and I just felt like, okay, here's my time to show these guys who I am. But I had this brand new Burton that had these water ski bindings that were terrible, and I kept catching edges and just slamming over and over and over again, totally embarrassing myself. And that night, I went out for a walk, smoked a joint, and was totally stoned in Vermont, kind of thinking to myself how embarrassed I was. But I thought, I'm going to have to just switch back to my old board because that's what I know, and that's what I know works. So I switched to my old board and finished in the top 16. So I made the finals for the downhill, because back in those days, it was like you had to qualify in the top 16 and then you'd go to the finals. And Jake comes running up to me in between the qualifiers and the finals with the red speed suit. He's like, here, put this on. It'll make you go faster. And I just looked at him and I said, well, am I on your team or what? He's like, yeah, you're on the team. So I was super stoked, grabbed the speed suit and put it on and finished like 9th place or something.
Now it's time to jump into my final set of sponsors, and winter is almost here. And you know what everyone needs? A beanie. Everyone needs one, even if you don't ski or snowboard, and warmth is super important. But you know what is just as important as warmth? Style. You don't want to look like an idiot out there when you don't have to. And Cole Headwear is going to make sure you don't look like an idiot, because they have the best fits and styles out there. That's why 9 out of 10 beanie wearers that I talked to said that Cole is the best. And now you can experience the style and warmth of Cole without paying full pop. I'm going to save you 15%. And all you need to do is head on over to coleheadwear.com, go shopping, and when you check out, enter the code POWEL15 to save 15% off your entire order. Last but not least is Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. For over 60 years, they have been getting people on the snow, in the water, and on the pavement. Not only have they provided a great retail experience, they also play against the big internet guys. Over on their website, peterglenn.com, you'll find great brands, great products, and deals. Peter Glenn also offers shipping on orders over $49. They'll match the price found at other websites. If you need something ski, snowboard, wakeboard, or inline skate related, head on over to peterglenn.com. Those are my sponsors. Now let's get back into the podcast. What does that mean you're on the Burton team at this point? Do you get a box of boards sent to you later and travel and money? Or is it just something that you know and it just means something to you?
It was status for sure. I had to give the suit back to him.
After the race?
Oh, yeah. It was like they kept pretty close tabs on those suits, at least for that year, because I do have a suit still from subsequent years, but it really was more of a status thing, and it meant a little bit of privilege, and in those days, I mean, that was 1984. So getting acceptance at ski areas was the primary objective for Burton especially, but for all the riders too, because we all wanted to go to ski areas. We wanted to be able to ride chairlifts. So it became this coalition in a way to strategize which ski areas and who could we talk to, and do you know people at your local ski area that you could talk to let you up the lifts. So that was a big part of being a team rider, but more status, and then having access to the newest products because there was so much new development. And I would say, it was a little bit more for me because I was so far away from Vermont. And it was such an interesting area, I think, for Burton that he actually sent me at my urging. I was like, hey, I'll give lessons to people. I'll get people into the sport. I had so much enthusiasm for it that I talked him into sending me like 20 performers. And I had a whole room full of performers. And I would just let friends borrow them for weeks at a time. And just, anybody from school who wanted to try one, or anybody who I knew. I was out of high school by that point, but I was really into promoting snowboarding and trying to get the ski areas to let us up. And I would say that was a big part of being a team rider at that point, because there was only 2 contests. There were only two contests in those days. It was the Worlds at Soda Springs, and it was the Nationals in Vermont.
Anybody involved with snowboarding at that point is involved in a lot of firsts, I think. And for you, you're like the third snowboard instructor in the world or something like that. You have that claim to fame. Were you super nerding out about instructing and developing curriculum like a lot of instructors do today, just trying to make people better? But was that like a big focus for you back then?
The focus was to just get people up on their feet and be able to make turns both ways and stop, because at the same time, ski area acceptance was all about control. I mean, so many things simultaneously were happening. One of the reasons I was drawn to Burton was that they were focused on hardpack riding. And I think it became clear that if we wanted ski area acceptance, we had to be proficient on hardpack snow. So teaching people how to turn both ways and stop was a big deal. And Mike Chantry and Joel Gomez pretty much headed the program at Soda Springs. And Joel would come up from the Bay Area and stay at my house or at Chantry's house. And over time, I think, they encouraged me to join their program and be an instructor. And it was fun. I mean, the winter of 84, 85, I taught snowboarding at Soda Springs and at Slide Mountain, because at the same time, Chris and Bev Sanders wanted to develop an instruction program at Slide Mountain, and I helped them do that as well. And it was interesting because Soda Springs didn't have certification, but Slide Mountain did. So I was the guy who pretty much judged if you could turn both ways and stop. And if you couldn't, I would say, well, you need a lesson, which gave me business too.
You're the guy that made people take the test, which it seemed like everybody had a test back in the day. You were on Burton for about 3 years before I think you quit in like 1987. And it's crazy for me to think that anybody would quit Burton, especially at that time. But what happens there? Why do you guys part ways?
Well, Andy Coughlin and I were really emboldened because he finished, I don't know, he won the overall, or maybe he got second in slalom or GS or something at the Worlds in 86. And I got third in the halfpipe in 86 at the Worlds. So both of us thought we were really hot shit. We were both emboldened. And I remember sitting in his apartment in Boston, and we wanted to go to the North American Championships that Ken Achenbach had put on at Sunshine Village in Canada. And Jake didn't want to pay our expenses. And we felt like he owed it to us because of everything that we had done for him. And we thought he must be making money now, and he's got the money to pay for it. So we're sitting there in Andy's apartment and just getting pumped up on each other's comments to the point where, we said, well, fuck it. If he won't pay for it, we'll find somebody who will. And we got on the phone with Jake, and I think I was the one who said, well, if you won't pay for it, we'll find somebody who will. And he ended up paying for it, and he wasn't too happy about it. So I stayed on Burton until the next year. Actually, about a year and a half from then, I had my shop, Sessions in Denver. Joel Gomez and I were partners on. I was a Burton Team rider, so I was super focused on racing because I was a ski racer, so I enjoyed running gates too. And I didn't think I was going to be a very good freestyle rider because Terry and all these other guys were so much better than me at freestyle anyhow. Burton came out with this express board that had a tapered tail and this really big nose on it. And I wanted to cut the nose off because to me it seemed like it was just like a hindrance for racing. And I asked Jake if I could take one of the boards out of stock. If I took my team board and I cut the nose off and for some reason it delammed or didn't work, could I just take one of the boards out of my stock at my shop and get credit for it? And Jake was like, no, you can't do that. And that was like the last straw for me. I just thought I was hot shit. And there were tons of other boards available on the market. And I said, okay, well, then I quit. And it was stupid. It was maybe the worst decision that I had made in my life because Burton was a great gig. And clearly the next few years were major changes for Burton as they got more into all around and freestyle boards.
Yeah, I mean, they went from being on top of the industry, but everybody was pretty much at a level playing field. It seemed like there was a lot of brands that could have just run with everything. And Burton did. And for the next 30 years, every other brand has been chasing Burton. Almost every innovation and everything that's happened in snowboarding, a lot of it can be credited to them. Jake would be a big part of it because he did put a shit ton into his riders and developing product. It's just, I don't know, back then, maybe it didn't feel like that to you. But I think you go next. I don't know if it is next in the rotation or not, but Kemper is a brand that you ride for as well. And it's weird because Kemper is running ads for you in all the magazines at the same time that you have your snowboard shop. But then Kemper is coming in with a guy named Jamie Salter, who's like a name in snowboarding. I'm not really setting this up well, but there's this villain in snowboarding named Jamie Salter who worked for Kemper, and he took a lot of businesses and made a lot of money for them. But he pretty much killed your shop almost by undercutting you in the marketplace that he was in. How does that work?
Yeah, well, I did ride for a couple of other brands before that. I rode for Sims a little bit. I rode for Snowtech, but Kemper was 88, 89, something like that. And Jamie was a really nice guy when I first met him. He seemed totally cool. You know, they took us up to Whistler and we did this big photo shoot. Mike and Tina Bassich were part of that. Hetzel and, you know, all these other guys who were way better snowboarders than me. We're all part of that. And at the same time, I had my shop. I had sessions in Denver, and I was so blown away that they had made a deal with Colorado Ski and Golf. And Colorado Ski and Golf had a store about 2 blocks from my shop, as well as a store in Boulder, Boulder Ski Deals. And they had about 1,000 Kempers in stock, as opposed to my 30 Kempers that I bought. And Joel and I had a policy to buy all of our inventory on cash. We didn't have credit. We pretty much wanted to own all of our inventory because we felt like that was the way to go, which was pretty stupid in retrospect, because if you leverage yourself out, you can do a lot more with your business, as a lot of people know. And I also was not that good of a businessman in terms of running my shop. I didn't understand the margins or any of that stuff. So my staff became more and more disenchanted with what was going on at sessions because I had an attitude. And like I said earlier, I had a negative aspect to me that probably showed through to some of my employees. So a lot of them actually quit and started working for Colorado Ski and Golf. And it all kind of came to a head when they were running ads every day in the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News for Kempers at basically 20 or 30 bucks over my wholesale cost. It pissed me off so much because Kemper was running ads in the snowboard magazines that I was part of, but yet they were selling to the shop up the street for way less than what I was buying the boards for, and they were killing me. And I couldn't compete. And I called up Jamie Salter. I was really pissed off. I told him I was going to quit and I wanted to send the boards back. And he was like, "Oh, no, man, don't worry about it. I'm going to come out there and fix the problem." Well, he came out all right, but he spent his whole time, like 2 or 3 days, with the Colorado Ski and Golf guys and called me one night. And he's like, "Hey, I'm going to stop by your shop tomorrow. What time do you open?" I was like, "Well, on Tuesdays, we open at noon." So he shows up before noon, and when I got there at opening time, there were about 50 Kemper stickers plastered all over the windows of my shop, and one on the door with his business card attached to it. I went straight to the bank, canceled all my post-dated checks, and called up the accounting department at Kemper and told them I wasn't paying, that I had canceled all those post-dated checks. And if they wanted their boards, they could come and pick them up because I wasn't going to go through the trouble of boxing them up and sending them back. So, yeah, I was really angry with both Colorado Ski and Golf and Jamie Salter for a long time. I still think Jamie Salter, didn't do snowboarding a great service. It's amazing now. I forget what he's in charge of, but he's in charge of, some
Brooks Brothers or something.
Yeah, like billion. Yeah, he's made billions probably, and good for him.
He was behind Ride, right? Like he was one of the main players there?
Yeah, definitely. He helped start Ride and finance it and all that stuff. But my anger towards Colorado ski and golf was really misdirected because I should have been looking in the mirror at my shortcomings as a business owner, because that was really the cause of all that stuff.
So you moved back to Tahoe after that. You shut that down. You worked for Apocalypse Snowboards and Santa Cruz Snowboards, and you cut your teeth on the distribution and branding of things. And that's when you learn the business aspect, a little bit of the sport. But Palmer, who's a friend of yours, and you've befriended a lot of people in the Tahoe area, Palmer being one of them, you've negotiated his contracts, you do a lot of things with him, but you have the opportunity to create Palmer Snowboards. And it's not something that he's like, I'm going to create my own snowboard line. I think it's another brand in Europe that comes to him and's like, can we use your name and build a brand around it? And you're the point man behind it all. Is that how that works?
To an extent, yes. We ended up meeting a Swiss guy who was pretty young, and his family owned the largest independently owned meat company in Switzerland. And man, those Swiss eat a lot of meat. So they had a lot of cash. And the guy had gone snowboarding with Evelyn Worth, who worked for Sims. And in those days, DNR Sports System ran both Santa Cruz and Sims. So Sean and I had, a lot of people in common that we were dealing with. And Evelyn was good friends. Her now husband went to college with this guy from the meat company. And he had really a great time snowboarding with Evelyn and her husband. So he was really interested in investing in snowboarding. And so she introduced the Swiss guy to Sean, and one thing led to another, and he wanted to start a brand. Sean was more and more disillusioned with Tom and Sims and the whole operation. So one thing led to another, and this guy invested some money into it, and Sean wanted me to run the U.S. distribution. He felt like I had to be involved in his company, which was a great compliment to me and a great opportunity for me to learn all about manufacturing and distribution.
Going into it, it's learning all about. So when you're learning about this, does the Swiss guy know a lot about it, or are there a lot of mistakes made along the way?
Oh, there were tons of mistakes. He knew nothing about it. He was a butcher. He knew how to butcher things, but he didn't know how to build things. So we hired an engineer, this guy Christian Brach, who had helped Elon develop the parabolic skis, the first real shaped skis. And he's an Austrian guy from the Salzburg area. So the first thing we did was meet up with this engineer, and he started talking about pre-preg technology and how we needed to be involved in pre-preg technology because that was the future, and that's pre-impregnated fiberglass. So he kind of steered us into Blizzard skis, or Blizzard skis, in Mittersill, Austria, and they were going through all this financial stuff, as all those ski companies have. And we were encouraged to work with some other factories, but we chose Blizzard because they seemed really enthusiastic about helping us, as well as this new pre-preg technology. So we set up shop with Blizzard, and they made the first boards for us. And we had some falling out with the engineer, and we ended up hiring another engineer who worked at Blizzard, this guy Peter Martin, who was just really sharp and a genius. And he ended up setting up a factory. We had to buy some presses for Blizzard, and we ended up taking those presses out of Blizzard and moving down the road to Bischofshofen and setting up a factory there that Peter Martin ran. And we built all of our own stuff there. But it was all locked into this pre-preg technology, which ended up just being super expensive. And that's why the first year that we had Palmer, we had the thickest, stiffest, heaviest, most expensive boards in the market.
Something to hang your hat on. The boards were always expensive, it seemed like, and you always had some cutting edge technology. It was honeycomb. It was all kinds of different shit. And it was like, It was Palmer. It didn't seem like he needed that. He could win on whatever board he was on, I felt like. But it was the target like, hey, we've got Palmer, this premium, I want to say premium, but he's almost like premium out of the trailer park athlete, and we're going to make all the price points that high as well?
Well, it was a little bit of a natural progression and the natural regression and progression where, we encouraged the Swiss and the Europeans to market the brand like an American brand, but they didn't get it. Like they had no clue what that meant, and they were all about the technology. So, because we were locked into this really expensive high-tech product, the first year of Palmer was a total disaster in terms of marketing. So the Swiss guys basically said, we're not going to let Sean Palmer run the marketing anymore. We're going to do it. And it's all based on technology. So that's where the falling out for Sean and the Swiss guys in his own company started, because he was really frustrated that they wouldn't market the brand the way that he wanted them to market. They were too conservative and they wanted to market technology. And I think from the Swiss guys' perspective, we were locked into this technology, and the only way that we could overcome Burton or any other snowboard brand out there would be to promote this technology. And that was what it was all about. We were totally locked in from a financial perspective. We couldn't just get rid of the equipment that we had in the factory and use cheaper stuff. We had to use that expensive stuff. So we felt like we needed to market it. And fortunately, Palmer found Bordercross, and Bordercross developed in the industry. And Sean was so good at it that it was really easy for us to say, hey, look at this technology. He wins on it.
Yeah. Well, there's more we could talk about in your career because you become an agent. You work with, a ton of different athletes. Brad Holmes, you start a production company with. We're not going to talk about Chainsaw Productions. What we are going to do is talk about Brad Holmes. And I have a segment in my show that I call Inappropriate Questions, where I get someone that you know to ask you 3 inappropriate questions. And I figured the best person to go to is Brad Holmes because he knows you very well, I would think, over the past, I don't know how many years. And I'm going to jump in and play question number 1 from Brad right now.
All right.
Bob, you and Tom Sims were famous for wearing stretch suits snowboarding. Who wore it better? And go into detail about the first time you saw Tom Sims on slope with a wetsuit.
Great question, Brad. First time I saw Tom Sims in a wetsuit on slope was probably the 1983 World Championships. It could have been at that Ski Cooper contest in 81, but I'll go with 83 at the Worlds. And I had a lot of negative feelings for Tom at the time. So I thought he was the biggest kook on the planet. I mean, we all wore wetsuits because we thought that was going to make us go faster, and it kept us warm. So I wasn't the only one, Brad, but yeah, Tom pretty much made it famous because he won contests in wetsuits. And I thought he looked like a jackass.
And why didn't you like him back then? Were there business decisions that he made that you questioned, or what was the deal?
I don't know if it was business decisions so much. It was more about like the product itself. As I said earlier, I felt like Tom Sims was this well-known guy with a skateboard company that was really well-known. And I just felt like what audacity he had to show up in Tahoe and act like he owned the sport. And he made these boards that had all these stupid contours on the bottom. Like I felt like snowboards should evolve to be like skis. Like they should just be a giant wide ski with that technology. And to me, the technology looked stupid. And then I misinterpreted his attitude. Like I thought he was arrogant and thought he was kind of an asshole. But the reality was he just had tons of energy and enthusiasm for promoting snowboarding, just like everybody else did. And so, in retrospect, I was the wrong one. And he was just a guy who was super fired up to go out and promote. But I also didn't like some of his tactics because there were a lot of self-serving tactics. Like at the first World Championships, they groomed the hill and he wouldn't let anybody up on the hill. And he went up and made turns down the groomed run. And then his team of Sims sycophants were pretty much putting the gates in as turns. And anybody who ski raced knew that that was like totally against the rules. Like you couldn't do that. You had to make it fair. Anybody who ski raced that was there was totally complaining about it. There were many other incidences that pissed me off about Tom, but in retrospect, he was a good guy.
All right, we will go with the next question from Brad Holmes.
Bob, what was the most embarrassing Fungus show we ever played?
So first, you got to tell everybody who Fungus was.
All right. Fungus was a band that Sean Palmer and myself and Brad started. And actually, Matt Reardon and Jason Atwood were our first two guitar players.
Huh.
Matt Reardon is also a skier from the Tahoe area.
Still plays music, too.
Yeah, he still plays music, too. But that didn't last long. Jason Atwood was a kid that I grew up with in Tahoe, and he is a super nice kid, and he was a snowboarder also. But he didn't have the time or something for band practice. And I don't know what happened to Matt. I don't know why he ended up not playing with us anymore either. But man, I think it was really Palmer. Palmer found a better guitar player in his mind, and that was this guy, Dan Posniak, who was in 7 Seconds.
Okay.
Awesome, famous punk band.
Yeah.
So Brad and I and Paz and Palmer played in Fungus, and we had a lot of good shows. Our whole motto was every show we do in Tahoe is great, but any show we do outside of Tahoe is terrible. And we probably all have our own theories as to why, but basically the band was comprised of 2 alcoholics, a speed freak, and a stoner. And when you mix those ingredients, you get some funny results for sure. And probably the most embarrassing show that we played was on Sean Palmer's birthday at the Roxy. And it was for a Snowboarder magazine party. And Palmer had this whole theory with the band that we only headline. So we show up at the Roxy, which is a pretty important theater and show. And on the marquee, there's like 50 bands on it. And the Electric Love Hogs were top billing, and they turned into the band Goldfinger, which is a pretty big band. But at the very end, it said, and Fungus. And Palmer was so mad, he went in immediately, like we hadn't even unloaded any of our equipment. He goes straight into the Roxy, finds who's in charge, and makes them come out with a ladder and move Fungus from and Fungus to in front of the Electric Love Hogs. So now we're headlining. And I look at him and I'm like, oh, great. So now instead of playing at 8 o'clock, we're going to play at fucking 2 o'clock in the morning. And I knew what that meant too. That gave Palmer and Holmes lots of time to drink. And, me and Paz lots of time to do what we do. So probably what was really embarrassing was the Electric Love Hogs had some song about how skiers suck. And I was listening to it, and Holmes and Palmer were backstage drinking or something. And I was shocked. I was like, oh man, these fucking guys are talking shit about skiing. So I went up to Brad, like right before we go on. I'm like, dude, you gonna let these guys get away with that shit? Like, that's fucking bullshit. You can't let them get away with that shit. So sure enough, we play our first song, and Palmer comes out. He's wearing like this clown suit. He had the clown haircut. It's his birthday. He's got these big, huge pig slippers on his feet. And we play our first song, and it probably didn't sound very good because everybody was all fucked up and it was super late at night. And before the crowd could even react to anything, Holmes goes up to the mic and he's like, fuck all you fucking snowboarders. and you could hear a few people kind of laugh, like thinking it was a joke. But Holmes just ran with it. He's like, man, fuck all you fucking snowboarders. I've been skiing since before you were born, and I fuck you guys. And just like totally bummed out the crowd to the point where after every single song, there was nothing. There was nobody booing. There was nobody cheering. There was nothing. It was just like silence after every single song. maybe, a few songs you'd hear somebody in the crowd just be like, "Fuck you, Palmer." And it was super embarrassing because Sean was friends with MCA, Adam Yauch from the Beastie Boys, and he was at the show because Palmer wanted him to sign us up to their record label. So after the show, we're standing there and MCA comes up and Sean's like, "So, what do you think?" And MCA looks at us and he goes, "Well, it's never a good thing when you piss off the crowd on the first song." So I would say, Brad, that was probably the most embarrassing show we ever had.
That's amazing. All right, we'll go with this final inappropriate question.
Bob, tell us what you dislike about Trump the most and what happens if he's around for another 4 more years. Don't hold back.
All right, you've got like a minute.
All right, that's a heavy one. So what I dislike about Trump the most is that he has totally split our country apart. I think it's been awful for any minority, anybody who has a brain seems to understand that this president has been so divisive and just so harmful to what's been building up, I would say, since 1991. It's just so bad for our country in the sense that we are so farly divided that I think it's going to take generations for things to be repaired. And I'm just really fearful that if he's reelected here in the next 4 or 5 days, that we're going to end up being more divided. I mean, forget any of the financial policies or any of that stuff. I think that there's corruption on both sides of the aisle, but I really feel like having Trump in office is just divisive for our society, and I don't think it's good.
Huh. Well, I thought you were going to be a lot worse than that, but I do agree it is divisive, and another 4 years will increase the divide a little bit, in my opinion. Other people have other opinions, and that's fine. That's why we are America, and it is what it is.
Well, I mean, he's a fucking douchebag. I mean, that's clear, but I don't need to say that. Everybody already knows that, so.
All right, well, I want to thank you for your time. Looking at your career, like, you are one of the godfathers, man. You are the first wave. I talk to a lot of people. There's a lot of living legends that are like the second wave or the third wave, or I've had talked to Dave Downing. He's like 3 generations past you almost, it seems like, in just the history of snowboarding. And it's great to hear your perspective on the sport. And I'm glad that you can kind of see your faults throughout your career and you shared them with us on the podcast. And you also called out people you didn't like. And I love when people do that on the podcast because that's what these things are for. So I thank you for doing that. Thank you for your time, and have a beer sometime when we're allowed to have beers.
Yeah, I really appreciate the call and the time and the research. You do a great job researching, and I really appreciate you thinking that I'm worthy of even talking to.
Well, I will say that this interview happened because I looked at your LinkedIn, and not 20 minutes after I looked at your LinkedIn, I had a message in my inbox saying, "Hey, when do you want to do the interview with me?" Which I thought was pretty cool. I was like, I don't know, like a month or so. But that's how this thing came together, given I was going to reach out to you.
Yeah, well, it's funny, too, because I thought I was talking to a different mic. Once I realized I sent it to you, I was like, oh, shit, that guy probably thinks I'm an idiot.
So that was time with Bob Klein. And from everyone I've talked to, Bob is a really good dude. You listen to him and hear him talk about his life and times, and he comes off as a guy who's been able to pinpoint what decisions he made that he regrets in his life, and he owns them. And from my experience with this podcast, not that many people are able to do that. Most people don't say, I wish I didn't do this or I wish I didn't do that. They just keep talking about what they did and move forward. But Bob is able to look back and reflect on everything. And it's cool that he's got the self-awareness to pick apart his life and times and see where the problems were, because not everybody can do that. And on top of all of that, Bob literally is a living history lesson. We could have talked for hours and gotten so much more out of him, but you know this podcast. It's an hour and 15 minutes max. I kind of want to shoot myself in the face after we go for much longer than that. So that is Bob's podcast. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to ask you to do something that is very, very important to me. That is to review me with stars. And to do it, it takes about a minute. It's so easy. So what you need to do is grab your iPhone, click the podcast icon, search for the Powell Movement, click my logo, scroll down to where you see the stars, click 5 stars, and you're done. Even if you subscribe to the show already, you still need to do it that way, but it does help the show grow. And if it doesn't help the show grow, well, it does make me feel better when I see these reviews. If you write comments, it makes me feel even better than that. So it is greatly appreciated. Again, I want to thank you all for listening and thank my amazing sponsors who make this thing happen. They are Stanley, the 10 Barrel Brewery, Cole Headwear, and Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. Have a great week, everyone.